Hi everybody, my name is Jim and I'm an alcoholic. Member of the Stairway Group. My sobriety date is December 20th, 1964. I wanted to caution you that as you walk from that end of the room or from that end of the room, the center room of the room is now sagging. Got about 150 years of sobriety sitting right at this table, so be careful not to trip as you come by. You know, I was thinking, I was coming up from Islamorada, and there was an electric storm. It reminded me, I don't know, I suppose this is not a true story, but it might be. It sounded like it might be. You see, there was this priest, and he was an avid golfer. And he also had kind of a bad mouth, and quite a temper. And he always grabbed one of the young novitiate nuns to caddy for him. So he was out on the golf course, and there was a kind of a storm coming up, but he thought he could play on through. And he lined up a short putt, and he swung his club, and the ball rolled and missed it. He says, "Damn it, missed again." And the nun went, "Father, God isn't going to like that." Went to the next hole and lined up a short putt. Darn if it didn't go right by the hole. "Damn it, missed again. Father, God is not going to like that." The final hole of the golf course. Lined up a short putt, tapped it toward the hole, and it rolled right by. "Damn it, missed again." At that moment, this great bolt of lightning came flooding down out of the sky. Hit the nun. Crispy critter. And this great voice came down out of the sky. "Damn it, missed again." Oh my. You know, looking around, I remember when we first started this shindig, there was standing room only, but you know, when you first start out, there's always a lot of tire kickers. Going to come see how well we entertain or something, I guess. But as you go along through the book, the people who really care and really want to help themselves and recover, they're the ones that you see that come back at every meeting. I'm glad to see all of you here tonight, really am. Tonight we're going to be continuing our reading and discussion of Bill's story, and we're going to be starting on page 14. Somebody suggested I was supposed to apologize for only getting one page done last week. And I absolutely refuse to apologize for that. There's a whole lot of material on that page. But bear with me, because we want to be sure we're all on the same page here and we know where we're coming from, and we can see after that where we're going. Remember on page 13 that we found Bill going through steps 3 through 11 while he was still in the hospital. I had to remember that tonight. It just came back to me because I heard a lady talking about the fact that, she said it was a fact, that it takes at least 2 years before you're ready to work the steps. Something about slow motion or some kind of a newfangled theory of AA, I guess. There's a lot of that stuff out there, you know. And some of it I hear and I don't believe my ears, and some of it I just gag a little bit, and others of it I have to laugh. But you know, really isn't much of a laughing matter, is it? Because all of us are sitting here under a sentence of death. We need to be awfully careful what we say to somebody who's new. Because they're listening. They want guidance. If we tell them something that hasn't a thing in the world to do with recovery, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. In any event, Bill, while lying in the hospital at Towns Hospital in New York City, had already worked his first and second steps with his friend Ebby before he got there, and while in the hospital, as we find on page 13, he had worked all the other steps except 10 and 12, and 10 we discussed last week did not come along until 3 years later. 10 was a product of trial and error, as we found out, and it is not included anywhere along the line in any of the references to the steps they were working, which were basically the steps of the Oxford movement. finally it shows up in the big book, and the first appearance of step 10 is in the first manuscript, the original manuscript that Bill wrote, and that's where we find 10 for the first time. Also, missing from this recitation on page 13 is the 12th step. And tonight we're going to see where the 12th step came from. And then we're going to cogitate together on what would be our fate if that had not happened. You and I sometimes have to think back and understand just what slender threads this whole thing hung on back in those days. Any one of those threads having been broken or not having been in place at all, and we wouldn't be here. And you trace that through, what you find is that God's hand was there at all times. That things were happening that ought not to have happened. They were happening in exact sequence and at exactly the right time with the right people, to a point where when we walk in the door now, if we're new, we look around and we see a room full of people, and we think almost this has always been here. You know, it's full blown. But that's not true. We're still evolving, of course. Some are evolving in the direction of the humpback of Notre Dame, and others are evolving into a likeness of the angels that our spirits are able to soar with when we are set free. But nevertheless, we are evolving. And so when we look at the history of this fellowship, we have to marvel at how we came to be here and how this fellowship came to survive all of the things. It never should have survived. It couldn't. In all of human history, nothing like this had ever survived, because human beings take every great inspiration, every great idea, and tear it apart out of their own ego and their own self-serving and their power driving and their need to be in charge. And that didn't happen with AA. Thank you, God. So in any event, Bill has worked those first 11 steps. And down at the bottom of page 13, let's see what's going on here. Ebby had been talking to Bill, and Bill was still in the hospital now, and Ebby was coming to see him just about every day. My friend promised when these things were done, referring to these steps, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator, that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. Underline the word all, please, because many people doubt that, and yet it's a direct promise here in this book which never lies. The elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. Now let's think about that for a second, because many people are of the opinion, and I'm one of them, that the answers to all of our problems lie in the big book. And here it talks about a way of living. But that's what the big book is. Big book teaches us a way of living. In the ninth step, it tells us that spiritual life is not a theory, that we have to live it. And we're taught how to do that. And the 12th step tells us what? Practice these principles in all of our affairs. What does that mean except to live our life in accordance with and in the practice of the principles which are the steps? So the way of living which answers all our problems is the way of the 12th step. Practicing these principles, working these steps in everything that we do. Staying close to God and performing His work well. Under which circumstances the book promises us that God will give us everything we need. And that's the truth. Which means that, as the book tells us, we're undisciplined, so we have to let God discipline us. We must be disciplined and consistent in applying these principles, working these steps in everything we do. Is it worth it? Of course it's worth it. You ask anybody at that table, is it worth it? Ask me, I'll be glad to tell you. Doggone right it's worth it. You can have the same kind of life that we have been granted, a life of happiness, joyousness, and freedom, which doesn't mean there haven't been heartache and hardship. Of course, every human life has that. But how much better it is when we face the hardships and the heartaches with God on our side. And we don't get to have that by wishing for it. We have to work for it every day. And so he says here that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. And here's the rule: belief in the power of God plus, now notice what comes first here now, belief in the power of God. What is belief? That's trust, isn't it? That's faith. Every place we look in this big book, it's telling us about faith. Faith and trust and belief. And remember too that faith without works is dead. Faith which is not utilized in our lives by actively trusting God has no power. It is dead. It is nothing but an attitude or a bunch of electrons racing around our brains. It doesn't mean anything. But belief in the power of God, now here's the action that activates that faith, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things. You see what this is telling us? That faith without works is dead, but faith which includes the willingness, honesty, and humility necessary to put in the effort and be successful in maintaining and establishing a new order of things. That's where the work comes in. That's where the faith comes in. That's where the trusting God comes in. I trust Him, and therefore I set myself free through that faith and that trust to live and love as Aquinas would have had us do. Remember his prayer. These were the essential requirements. Now Bill editorializes here a little bit. This isn't anything Abby taught him, but it's something he learned through hard experience. And by the time he got around to writing this book 3 years later, 3.5 years later, he knew for sure that this was true. Simple, but not easy. A price had to be paid. There are no free lunches in here, as there are no free lunches in life. Even those who are trust fund babies, they still have no free lunch. There are things, as a matter of fact, it's maybe 10 times harder for them to live their lives than it is to live than for someone who's a wage slave. Because we can be lulled into the sense that there is indeed a free lunch. I have a guy I sponsor who's now eight years sober, and he was a working guy, and he really put in the effort. And then he got started in something that made a lot of money without any effort. And he got so used to it now, I've had to take 6 sticks of dynamite in the last month, placed them directly under his derriere and blown them about 6 feet in the air so that he get the idea that he can't sit around and expect God to come and give him everything. He's gotten so doggone lazy I can't stand to look at him. He doesn't understand that the moment that we begin to vegetate, our brain starts to die. We go nuts. If you want any proof of that, you go on over there to the beach and you look around. How many men do you see walking up and down there? How many women do you see playing mahjong and enjoying the good life on the old man's money? Because he was working his tail off and he came down here from New York and he retired, and in 6 months he's dead. I get a kick. I was driving down Hallandale Beach Boulevard yesterday, and I drove past this car, and I could swear there wasn't anybody driving that car. I would have been willing to take an oath on it. But I got up right next to the car, and I looked in, and here was this little lady. I swear to you, she couldn't see anything over the hood of that car. I pity anybody walking in front of her or riding a bicycle. God bless her. She was still motoring on down the road. But you know, it's an interesting fact of life that when we stop learning, we start dying. I have a feeling that the strength of our spirit has as much to do with what we have been willing to learn and the exercises which we have continuously applied to our brain as it does to any religious concept. And I can't prove that, it's just a theory of mine. And I'm 74 years old, and I swear to you, if you tried to follow me around for 7 days, you'd be whipped. And it's not because of me. God gives me that strength. And it's wonderful. But I can tell you one thing, about 2 months ago I started a new business, which was something I had never been involved in before. I've had to learn a whole new business and a whole new vocabulary, and I'm having a ball doing it. I'm the first one in the office and last one to leave. You say, well, that guy must be nuts. Well, maybe so, but I can tell you this, I'm feeling great. And I'm convinced that we all have to have a purpose in life, a mission in life. We've got to keep on keeping on. The minute we stop, shoot. If you're going to stop, go down to one of these places and order your funeral in advance. Be kind to your relatives. Okay, that's editorializing. Simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. Now, Bill wrote this because he found this to be absolutely true in his own case. Because Bill was an absolute power driver. You remember we read his story, and you could see it all the way through his story. You go back here in the earlier pages of Bill's story, and you find that was his thing. He wanted claim, he wanted money, he wanted power. And he was willing to work hard to get it. But he was also the most self-centered guy around. And it was very, very hard for him to deal with this selfishness and self-centeredness for the rest of his life. And you would say, well, this is the guy that wrote this book, and he talks about self and selfishness being the root of our troubles, and you got to turn it over. Well, what in the heck happened to him? Well, he had to struggle, and he'll read his writings. There's a bunch of his stuff around. You're going to find out that he had some major struggles with that. There's a book called Soul of Sponsorship, which is a collection in large part of the letters between Bill Wilson and Father Ed Dowling. Father Ed was in St. Louis. He wasn't a member of the fellowship. He's a Catholic priest who was instrumental in many ways in getting AA started in St. Louis and the Midwest. And Bill considered Father Ed Dowling as his sponsor. And the letters back and forth are most revealing. There was Bill stripped naked, and yet those letters are all published. And we get a chance, for example, to watch Bill through the odyssey of writing the 12 and 12. And we see him horribly depressed, suicidal, tinkering around with LSD, and trying to become a Catholic. And they wouldn't have him in the Catholic Church because he refused to bend his stiff neck on some of their doctrine. He wrote at one time, for example, that he was only able to write one sentence at a time when he was writing the 12 steps in the 12 and 12. And so he gave a lot of this over to Father Ed and let Father Ed either write it or ghostwrite it or edit it, which means then that we got a whole bunch of Father Ed in the 12 and 12. Pretty interesting stuff, and that makes you, that explains why the 12 and 12, it runs contrary in many respects, 100%, absolutely diametrically contrary to the Big Book. Then you can begin to understand why that happened. Now then, we come to a statement here on page 14, which is the bedrock statement of the Big Book. In about 25 or 30 different places, in different contexts, we're going to find precisely the same statement. And the big book is always consistent with this statement, never varies from it. I must turn in all things. Please underline all things. Not some things. Not, oh golly gee whiz, you might sort of kind of like turn over to God every once in a while if you sort of like feel like it. This is in all things. To the Father of light who presides over us all. And what this means is then that when we run contrary to that, whether it is in our own recovery or what we are teaching others, we're running directly contrary to the big book. Example, if I were to say to you, you may not have a sexual relationship for 1 year. Well, of course, it's patently absurd on the face of it, but we're not going to deal with that right now. 1 year doesn't have any significance one way or another. But the problem there is that on the one hand, I'm saying to you, trust God in all things, turn in all things to the Father of light, except you can't have a sexual relationship for a year. Now, how does that work? I never quite figured that one out, did you? Of course, what the big book says is just the opposite. It says if you're having any trouble with something like this, you ask God in your morning meditation what you should do about each particular matter, and that the right answer will come if you want it. That's consistent with what we just read. And every time that we act and teach in a consistent manner, then we're right in tune with the big book, because the big book is never inconsistent, you see. What it really tells us as we go through this whole book, that in all things which are of importance to us, we must ultimately turn to God. And it also tells us that counsel with others is often important, but we let God be the final judge. So it's over and over and over and over again. For example, we learn that God will give us everything we need if we do two things. One, it is essential that we stay close to Him. Well, now what does that mean? Well, we know about the spiritual awakening. Certainly that connotes a closeness to God. But all we have to do is go back there just before the 11th step, and what do we find? That by working the first 9 steps, we have drawn close to God because we have entered the world of the Spirit, and we have been restored to sanity, and we have commenced to sense the flow of God's Spirit into us, and we have become God conscious, and we have developed this vital sixth sense which puts us in contact with our God. We are able through that to be inspired. Maybe not at all times. But at some point in our recovery we will come to rely upon that inspiration because we will find that we can. That this is real. This connection that we have with God. So what does it say again? To stay close to Him. All right? That means, of course, that what we're going to do is we're going to work our 10th, 11th, and 12th steps. We're going to do that every day to stay close to Him. What does the 11th step say? Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact, which means that by the time we reach the 11th step, we have achieved conscious contact, and this has happened through the grace of God and the working of the steps up to that point, hasn't it? Now, we're not going to get there if we are constantly running off on a lark of our own. Going back to this sexual stuff, how many times you heard people say, oh, it must be God's will that we be together. Well, that's supposed to put a stop to anybody's criticism or suggesting there's possibly the opposite. This does not mean that counsel with others is not often necessary. Of course it is. If somebody comes to us and asks, what do you think about me getting into a love relationship with this person? Well, and I've only I'm working on my third step. That's the famous one. I'm working on my third step. What's that mean? I'm afraid to work my fourth step is what it usually means. Why? Because third step's a prayer, isn't it? Have you figured out already that you got to quit playing God? Yes, I have. Have you figured out already that if you quit playing God, there's got to be some kind of a power in your life? Yes, I have. Well, haven't you decided then that hereafter in this drama of life, God's going to be the director? He's going to be the principal and you the agent. He's going to be the father and you the child. Haven't you come to that decision? Isn't that logical? Isn't that reasonable? Otherwise, you're going to be sitting out there in a void. You got to quit playing God. Where does your power come from? Well, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, and so much longer you plan to keep on working the third step? Hasn't somebody sat you down and explained to you that the fourth step is the step which will save your life? That it's not all that difficult? That it is not an indictment of you or anybody else, but simply a search to find out the truth about yourself? To find out what your present reality is. Where do we go from here with God's help? Right? But I'm working on my third step now. I found this young lady and she's absolutely wonderful. I'm certain that the way we came together, I can see God's hand all the way across the board now. Because remember, I was sitting down there at the coffee shop. What do you call that place where everybody goes now? Starbucks. What is it? Starbucks. Oh, Starbucks. Yeah, I was sitting down there at Starbucks paying $45 too much for 3 coffees. And this young lady walked in and she looked at me and I looked at her, and it was magic there. It was absolutely wonderful. And she didn't say anything to me that day, but the next day I was back there again, hoping she might show up, and guess what? She did. It's got to be God's will. Well, look, you haven't even admitted to finishing your third step yet. You really think that you're in a kind of spiritual condition to be able to make a commitment to another person? Do you believe that you are in a position where if something does not work out exactly right, you're going to be the father of a child? Do you have to set up housekeeping with somebody you barely know? Have you figured that one out yet? And there are ways that we can talk about this without making it a rule, because it ain't no rule. God makes the rules. And every time that we forget that, we go off half-cocked, because we begin to exert our so-called power. We begin to become the masters. We begin to become the manipulators, and that's a bad thing because that's not our business. Now we're going on page 14. After all of that, we've really progressed a long ways. We started on page 14. We've gotten 1 paragraph done so far. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. Now here's a really interesting thing, guys. Remember back there a little bit earlier in Bill's story, he kind of alluded to the fact that he had a spiritual experience, an epiphany. But he really didn't describe it. Let's see where he talked about that. Okay, on page 12, this third full paragraph, that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. And then down at the bottom of the page, the real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. For a brief moment I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have Him with me, and He came. But soon the sense of His presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself. And so it had been ever since. How blind I had been. Now then, we go over here, and we're going to see Bill having his epiphany right here in this paragraph. And he doesn't tell us what happened, but in other writings, let's first see what he did, and then we'll see how it affected him. In his other writings, several different places, he describes for us what had happened. He was there in the hospital, and he'd come to the conclusion that he really needed to reach out. And so he prayed. And he prayed, God, if you are there, please show yourself to me. Here's what happened. There was a sense of victory, followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. What don't we understand about that last sentence? That God comes to most men gradually, meaning, of course, no burning bush, no flash of light, gradually, over a period of time. But his impact on me was sudden and profound, which takes away all of the grounds upon which Appendix 2 was written, with the idea that somehow you and I are too stupid to understand what Bill just wrote here. That we're going to be confused and believe that we have to have an epiphany in order to get sober. It's not true. If we can read, we can see what that says. We understand. It's not in the least bit hidden there. But anyway, that's how that thing came about. Now then, Bill was pretty shook up by this, and in other writings he talks about how he really thought there was something wrong with him. He thought he was going nuts. I mean, he thought he was imagining things. You know, it's like if you were sitting around one day watching your favorite TV show, and all of a sudden saw a ghost and one floating across in front of the screen, you know, something totally out of ordinary experience. You probably wouldn't tell anybody about it. Hope it never comes back. For a moment, he said, I was alarmed and called my friend, the doctor, that was Dr. Silkworth, to ask if I were still sane. He listened in wonder as I talked. Finally, he shook his head, saying, something has happened to you I don't understand. Oh, but you better hang on to it. Anything is better than the way you were. And boy, wasn't that the truth. Remember what Bill had been told not too long before this, sometime around probably in the latter part of September 1934. And here we are right around Christmas time in that same year. Back then, Dr. Silkworth had told Bill that there was nothing that anybody could do for him. If he didn't stop drinking, he was going to die. That he had about a year before he would go nuts or die if he didn't stop drinking. So he says anything is better than the way you were. That a good doctor now sees many men who have such experiences. He knows that they are real. Now then, here is where our 12th step comes from. And remember that Bill is still in the hospital. And remember that we have become convinced, most of us, that these steps in this big book are God-inspired. We're pretty well convinced that no human was able to amass all of this spiritual knowledge and teaching, but had to be inspired for it to happen. For example, just one example, and there are hundreds. When Bill lay down on that stormy night to write the 12 steps, and he was ill, and he took out his yellow pad, he knew he had to write down the steps. He didn't know how many there were going to be. He had written in his draft, here are the steps we took, which are suggested a program of recovery, and he had been agitated about this, knowing that he had to write down the steps, which had never been written down before. Not ever. It was all word of mouth. So he was lying in his bed with the yellow sheet of paper, yellow pad, and he started writing. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 minutes. That's all it took. And the 200 words which are changing the world came flowing out onto that paper. And in utter surprise, Bill looked at what he had written, and there right up front in the second step was God. And 5 more times, there was God. And he had no idea that's what was going to happen. And only a few of those words were ever changed, and not necessarily for the better, by the editorial people when they got hold of it. Tell me, or tell yourself, try to convince yourself that this was not the inspiration of God. Now, Bill knew about the 12th step. He didn't have any trouble writing about that. As a matter of fact, Bill wrote that having had a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics. Practice these principles in all of our affairs. Because right here we find what happened to him, which solidified in his mind until the day he died this whole idea, which is encapsulated and enunciated and activated by the 12th step. While I lay in the hospital, the thought came that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. You see, he already saw the future. He saw what I like to think of as that great still pond, which truly goes on forever, into which we toss a pebble and we start the ripples moving, and they keep going and spreading out and going. The 5 million of us that are around today came from this single seed. Remember the parable of the mustard seed. And this is where it all started. They in turn might work with others. My friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. Again, the word principles. These refer to the steps that Bill has just worked. Demonstrating these in all my affairs. It does not say working these for myself. It says demonstrating. To demonstrate, there must be someone who is an audience. To demonstrate means to show. The third step says, God, take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy love, thy power, and thy way of life. Amen. And looky here, this is exactly what this is saying. Demonstrate these principles to others in all of my affairs. I'm going to live my life in accordance with spiritual principles. Thank you, God, for giving me the power to do so that I can demonstrate to others your power, your love, and your way of life working in and through me. See what's happening here? Demonstrate these principles in all my affairs. So you see how the 12th step was coming into, it was just being born right here. Ebby went on to say to Bill, particularly was it imperative to work with others, as he had worked with me. Now this was Ebby at 2 months sobriety. Oh, but wait a minute, he couldn't do that. How could he possibly help anybody? 2 months, that's all he's been sober? For sure he couldn't chair a meeting. There is no way in the world he could be a trusted servant. And of course we'll have to say, sorry Ebby, you can't have a love affair. And you cannot make any major decisions. And you say you've worked all these steps? No. You're trying to get well by Thursday. But he did. Thank God he did. Thank God there wasn't anybody around to tell him he couldn't do it. That he shouldn't do it. That it was taking him 5 years to get the fog out of his brain before he'd ever even be able to reasonably contemplate what he's being taught. You may laugh, but think about the consequences of that to you and to me. We would not be here. Ebby didn't know he couldn't do this, so he went ahead and did it. Imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. We followed the progress, didn't we, through the first and second steps as he helped Bill to find his way through those 2 steps. And then showed him how to work the rest of the steps, except the 12th step. And now Bill has grasped the 12th step by inspiration. Then Ebby went on to say something, quoting St. James, the book of James. Faith without works was dead, he said. Well, heck, everybody knows that. I mean, if you've read any kind of religious works at all, in any faith spread out over the entire world, they figured that one out. Faith as a state of mind is useless. Faith without works, faith without the action of faith, which is actively trusting God, is dead. Faith without the action of spreading the faith, making sure that through our actions others see faith working in and through our lives so that they can want what we have and be willing to go out and do what we did to find faith. Faith without works was dead, he said, and how appallingly true for the alcoholic. Now this next sentence and the few that follow it form the absolute rock bottom basis of sponsorship and 12-step work. Without this understanding there would be no such thing. 4. If an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead, and if he did not work, he would surely drink again, and if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed. With us it was just like that. Now, how many people do you suppose who sit around these rooms have ever actually read those words? Or had them read to them? Or contemplated what they mean? Or been instructed as to what these words mean? This is a categorical imperative. This is one of those musts that doesn't say must. Because what it does is tells us the consequences of our failure to do something. If we fail to perfect and enlarge our spiritual life. Now, if you go to the 11th step, it says that we seek to what? We seek to what? Anybody remember? Okay. We seek through prayer and meditation to what? Improve. Okay. Here, to perfect and enlarge. 11th step, improve. 12th step, perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work with others. Oh, but wait a minute, there's one more word there, isn't there? Work and self-sacrifice. What is our primary concern? Go back to the 3rd step discussion on page 62. What is our problem? Our problem is selfishness and self-centeredness. And the alcoholic is an extreme example. The self will run riot. And how do we stay out of self? We work for others. What's to tell us when we get into the 4th step? This quiets the imperious urge. That the 10th step admonishes us. Then we resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help. In chapter 7 it tells us nothing will so much ensure immunity from alcohol as intensive work with other alcoholics. So here it tells us if we fail to perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, we cannot survive the certain low spots ahead. And if we did not work, we would surely drink again. And people say, I've worked the steps. I don't know. I've had 6 relapses. And I worked all the way through my 4th step once. And I've been practicing that 3rd step prayer because that's what my sponsor told me to do ever since then, and I keep relapsing. I can't figure it out. Or, I've gotten up to my 11th step. I do prayer and meditation every day. How many people do you sponsor right now? Oh, I don't sponsor anybody. Oh, How many times you sit around before the meeting or after the meeting and come to somebody and say, how you feeling today? What's going on? And listen to them, try to help them? Or do you sit back there in the non-smoking glass cubicle with all of the rest of the spiritually advanced people and never once get out where the sick, sore, and wounded are, but stay back there with that incestuous situation where everybody knows what everybody else is going to say, and they've been saying it together for years? What's the big book say? Stay on the firing line of life. Are we doing that? Many of us don't. And many of us pay the supreme price for that. Wow. Oh, well, we made it. We got more than one full page then. We got an additional 5 lines, so I don't want to hear any complaints next week, okay? We'll look at the rest of the beginnings of 12-step work with Bill and next week, and maybe we might even get into chapter 2, who knows. But we don't have a script for this, you know, guys. We just do it as it comes. And that's the way, by the way, you know, that's what we do with life. That's the way we do it every day. Every day when we get up, Big Book says we make a little inventory. Better to write it down, but maybe in our heads, of what we have to do that day. Consider our plans for the day. And we go to God and we ask Him. We ask Him to direct our thinking during the day, to be divorced from selfishness, self-pity, self-seeking motives, and dishonesty. And therefore, if we do that, we'll be able to live our life on a higher plane. And then what we do is we go out and we do what's in front of us to be done, whatever's on our plate. We do the next right thing as it presents itself, as best we know. And we leave the results up to God. And when we do that, our whole life changes. It just gets better. At the end of the day, we look back, and maybe we didn't get any results that we had planned upon, but God's results were those which we got, and we're going to look back and say, gee whiz, if I'd gotten what I wanted, it would have been a disaster. God knew what I needed. And I look back on that day when I did all those things, and I can see that it was a successful day. And then it doesn't matter what the results were, because I see that I did the next right thing. I can see that I did what was in front of me to be done, and I left the results up to God, and I didn't hurt another person. And that's a successful day, regardless of the results. And here's the magic part of that. If I can look back on my day and I can see that it was a successful day, I will be happy. Did you ever meet anybody who felt successful who was not happy? Did you ever meet anybody who felt happy, who felt a failure? I don't think so. It's those days when we force things to happen, when we are in charge, when we again try to play God, when we screw it up here and there and we don't let God come in. We look back on that day, and it doesn't matter if we made $10,000 that day, we know we were not successful that day. And almost always we'll say, I should have made $20,000, not just 10. Somebody cheated me, and I'm going to get even with that rascal tomorrow. That's the way our minds work. Okay, Chris, where are you? Come rescue me here.
I'm here.
Got to close this thing. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next week.
Amen. You keep coming back and worship your work. Yeah. How you doing?
We needed to do that. Okay.
Hi, how are you?
I'm Christy.
Okay.
I just wanted to see if you could sign this for me because I'm in the halfway house.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Put my glasses on here and see.
I just gotta get off.
Yeah. Okay.
I put speaker there. I already filled it out.
Oh, you filled it out. I'm sorry.
Just gotta sign your name.
Okay, sure.
Sir?
was such a strange evening. This guy was doing something, and I had they were talking about a license. It was all very hushy. No, what he says,
Pretty beat up? Okay.
he says that you were a lawyer.
You wouldn't mistake my
I'm looking for someone.
I think the children like it.
You found it.
I took my husband and my children. It's we watched it. They didn't watch for 20 years.
You're sure?
Bill? Everything okay?
Jimmy.
What's your name? Jim.
Jim too?
Yeah.
Any possible way to get the fans going? I just rode like 50 miles, man. I think the switch is behind you here. Some of them.
Yeah, go ahead. Wow, my goodness sakes alive. Look who's here again. Hello there, John. I'm Jim.
Wow.
Same thing as Saturday?
We're doing a big book here.
Promises.
Forever I am.
Promises. You do? Okay, you got two. All right, there's one of the ones up here. Just so you know, we gave me another one for you. Okay, no, it's still ridiculous. This guy's it's like 1982. That's cool. Just let you know. Good. Publish it.
He's done an editing job. He's got all 12 steps on one CD. Cool.
All right, so I got that.
Good, man. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll get it all finished.
You understand where I'm coming from?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
When I attend some of those meetings, all those guys come in there from local places. They don't have a fucking clue.
Chris,
The black hole.
I want a coffee.
How I got here?
Did you read the traditions?
Sure.
Okay, good. Okay, traditions, how it works. That's fine.
Feel free to call me. I'm going to do the help.
Okay, I gotta get this thing set up here for optimum sound. Let me see here. There. We'll make sure everybody hears you tonight, Jim.
How about you?
Very good, very good. Another day. another day. Where'd you get that thing?
Oh, this was, my home group gave it to me last year for the birthday.
Oh, that has a number of years on it too. Yeah. They were just generic with no numbers on it.
No, this one's got Bill and Bob.
You celebrate too.
Yeah, next to it.
20.
Yeah, you got a good one.
I listen to your CDs all the time. You always say you're surprised.
Okay.
I need a good memory.
Oh, okay. That's a good reason.
I remember anyhow, but I don't use it. I don't trust this thing up here.
All right. Good. Nice. Sure, a little mic right there. Okay. Okay. Yes. Help yourself. There's one there, and I've got yours. That's not yours.
Are you okay?
No, yeah, we're okay. I'm okay. I think. Are we okay? No, I'm not. I'm not. Well, I don't know about you, but I think it's time to start. I think it's time to start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bottom Line Group of Alcoholics Anonymous.